All right, so this is the first presentation over Africa. In this presentation, we'll go over human-environment interaction and also the physical geography of Africa. This first part I'll skip. It's a little short, kind of fun quiz we did in class. I'm just seeing what you know or don't know about Africa. So I'll get through that real quick. All right, so getting into landforms and basically how it's set up. So Africa is generally a giant plateau. So most of it is at about 1,000 feet above sea level. You don't see any like large mountain ranges or anything like that in Africa. There are some mountains, but just nothing too big, other than like Mount Kilimanjaro. And then there's a lot of rivers in Africa, but there's also a lot of basins, and so that's going to create a lot of waterfalls and also a good amount of just rapids and stuff like that. And so you can't necessarily use an entire river to navigate. So civilizations tend to stick around the parts of the river that they can actually move on. So like the Egyptians, for example, ancient Egyptians, they lived on about the first like 400, 500 miles of the Nile River before it gets to the first what's called a cataract, which is that break in the river, the waterfall. And so everything was centered around that area because that's the only part you could use to trade. And then Africa was basically the center of Pangea, so it hasn't really moved that much. When you look at the other continents around the world, a lot of them you can see how they fit next to Africa. Then the Nile River is the longest river in the world, and that starts in Central Africa and Lake Victoria and flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. And then here at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the Aswan High Dam that was built on the Nile River. We'll get to the pros and cons of that. So here you can see the Nile Delta. If you don't know what a delta is, you need to make note of that. So a delta is whenever a river begins to approach the area where it empties into the ocean, it fans out. And so there's different basically streams coming out that empty out. So it's not just one area that empties into the ocean. But because of this delta, this allowed the Egyptians to live in this area. So ancient Egypt occurred just in this green area for the most part. And there were some areas outside of it, but most of the people lived in this area because they relied on the river for life. And the desert provided protection for them from invaders and stuff like that. And that's why they were able to stay in power for so long. So another angle you can see from space, you can see the Nile winding north to the Mediterranean. There's the delta, and this is where it connects to the Middle East. That's the Sinai Peninsula. Israel is right there. And here you have the Red Sea. And then, like I said, we're going to talk about the Aswan High Dam in a little bit, which is right there and created this lake on the Nile. This is Lake Nasser. So all this water was backed up just from that one dam. There's an image of Lake Nasser, nice place to go sailing. Some other features, you know what rift valleys are. So rift valleys where you have two divergent plates. They're moving apart from each other. And as they move apart, a valley forms basically in the middle. So in Eastern Africa, we have the Great Rift Valley, which is this area over here on the map on the right. So this part of the plate is moving that direction into the Indian Ocean, while the rest of Africa is moving towards the west very slowly. But eventually this will break off and form an island. And that's how Lake Victoria and these other lakes have formed, is because of the splitting in the Great Rift Valley. Mount Kilimanjaro is also here, so you're going to see volcanic activity along this rift as well as magma comes closer to the surface of the crust there. So you'll see more volcanoes in that region of Africa. And there's Mount Kilimanjaro in the background, which is the most famous one, the biggest one of them all. All right, and moving into natural resources and kind of economic activities in Europe. So Africa has a lot of awesome natural resources. They have gold, platinum, chromium, cobalt, copper, phosphates, diamonds, oil, stuff like that. So they should be really rich. And that's again one of the big questions that we'll be answering in this unit is, you know, if Africa has so many amazing resources, why is it they're struggling so much economically? And so we'll look at the impact of European colonialism, the impact of the African slave trade, and then warlords and stuff like that today. So, you know, why they're not really benefiting from these amazing resources they have. So even though they have all these resources, still most Africans make their money from agriculture, so from farming. You need to know this number is 66%. So 66% of all Africans farm and make their living from that. And most of these are subsistence farmers. Now, this is where you're going to start also connecting and seeing why there's also a lot of hunger in Africa. And part of it is from here, right here. So you have cash crops, coffee, lumber, sugar, palm oil, and cacao. Cash crops are crops that are grown purely because they make you money. It doesn't provide any kind of food or anything like that for you. So the problem is that when you got a lot of Africans that are farmers and make their living from that, and most of them are subsistence farmers, that means that there's not extra produce being made for the rest of the population. And then a lot of land is being used for these cash crops because it makes them money. But then that limits the amount of land they can actually farm for food they need to eat. And so this is where you can get to a shortage of food. And that's why, especially in the poorest parts of Africa, the average person only eats about 1,200 calories a day, which leads to an average age of death of anywhere between 38 to 45 years old. Because of the lack of nutrition. But we'll get back to that in a minute as well. All right, let's move on to climate and vegetation. So as far as where Africa lies, most of it is in between the tropics. So you need to remember like what determines what's in or out of the tropics. So the Tropic of Cancer is the northernmost tropical line of latitude. So as far as just kind of give you an idea of where it is, it's basically just below Texas, maybe like 100, 200 miles south of Texas where the Tropic of Cancer is. So that's the northernmost line of the tropics. And then you have the equator, is going to be in the middle. And then below that, the same distance south of the equator as the Tropic of Cancer is north of it, you'll find the Tropic of Capricorn to the south. So if you're in between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn with the equator going in the middle, then you're in the tropics. That whole zone is the tropics. So basically, looking at this box, for the most part, this is the tropics. So it'd be Cancer, equator's in the middle, and then Capricorn's to the south. So anything in this zone going across the whole world, you're going to only see 2 seasons a year, a wet and dry season. So there's no, summer and winter and stuff like that. It's pretty much warm all the time, for the most part. Also in this area, we have the Sahara Desert, which is the largest desert in the world. But underneath this desert is a huge aquifer, and that's how people are able to live in certain parts of this desert. Like you can see in this photo, this palm tree here has been able to get access to the aquifer. So even though it averages about 6,000 feet below the desert, there's places where it comes up near the surface, and that's where you'll find an oasis. And that's, of course, where they can build some cities and stuff like that. But, of course, most of the people are going to live along the northern coast and the coastlines of Africa when it comes to the Sahara Desert, not so much in the middle. All right, so as far as moderate climates, there's 3 places you can go for moderate climates. First one would be along the Mediterranean, like hugging the Mediterranean. Right there, you'll find a moderate climate before you enter the Sahara Desert. The other one's going to be down here in South Africa, again, mainly along the coast. And then the next one's the Serengeti Plain, which is a grassland in Kenya and Tanzania, where you find a lot of the big wildlife like lions and rhinos and stuff like that. Then the Congo rainforest is in this area right here. And the Congo rainforest is dealing with the same problems as the Amazonian rainforest. So slash and burn farming, which you should know what that is. That's farmers coming in, cutting everything down and then burning it to get nutrients in the soil and farming. And so most of these are going to be, people that are relying on the land to survive. And then fuel wood. So a lot of the people in the Congo, don't have access to electricity, and so they're using wood to cook food and stuff like that. And so they need that on a daily basis. So basically the same thing as what we're seeing in the Amazon. All right, human-environment interaction, so what humans are doing to impact the environment in Africa. First one's desertification, and in particular in the Sahel. So first off, you need to know where the Sahel is. So the bottom part of the Sahara Desert, so you have the Sahara here. The Sahel is an area where the Sahara is actually growing. So it's a region where the Saharan Desert is growing south. And desertification is an area that is not desert, but it's turning into desert. And there are certain things that cause that to happen. So generally, these places are already dry locations, but then there's certain things that occur that cause this, the spreading of the desert to occur. So basically, for example, livestock overgrazing, so cattle coming in eating a lot of grass. It's going to get rid of the root systems that hold the soil down, and so if you get a dry period, then more sand is going to spread and get on the ground basically, and not really allow for new grass to grow. And also, cattle, when they're walking around, they compact the soil, and it's just called soil compaction. And when that happens, oxygen cannot reach the root systems, and therefore, limit the ability for anything to grow there. So, of course, the problem with this is, again, 66% of Africans make their living off of farming, and land that could be used to farm is going away because the desert's expanding. So you got a growing population and a growing desert, which isn't good. And so here you see desertification in Africa along the Sahel zone, and it's also occurring in southern Africa as well. Around the world, you see it, of course, in Africa, also in western United States, a little bit like in West Texas, down into Mexico, Argentina, a little bit in Brazil, a lot in Central Asia, and then over in Australia. All right, and then you need to be able to connect this again to starvation, as well as them using cash crops and stuff like that to grow in Africa, and just how it just exasperates those problems. So if you look at this chart, you'll see a couple things. You'll see population, square miles, and then arable land. So remember, arable land is farmable land. So here we have China, Europe, India, Japan, Mexico, and the United States. So the total population of this area is 3.3 billion people, with a square mileage of 11.1 million square miles. Arable land, 2.6 million square miles of arable land. Africa, and really this number needs to be updated. Africa has a growing population. It's growing rapidly. Today it's closer to 1 billion people in Africa. Square mileage, of course, hasn't changed, 11.6 million square miles. So they have more land than all of these regions combined. But the arable land is a lot lower, only 778,000 square miles, almost 779,000 square miles of arable land, which is a lot less than 2.6 million. And so you got 1 billion people with a rapidly growing population. You have desertification, so the desert's expanding. They're losing land they can farm on, so that number's going down. And you've got, of course, cash crops that take up a lot of that land. So you have a limited area where you can actually grow crops that feed people. And then you got increased numbers moving into urban areas, which means those people living in the cities are relying on farmers in the countryside to farm for them. So they can barely farm enough food for themselves just for their own family to survive, much less somebody in a city. And so this is going to put pressure on those cities and those countries that have larger urban populations to then have to import food and stuff like that, which makes food more expensive because then you have to pay for it to be imported in. Instead of growing it yourself. And so you can see how this creates a lot of problems and how they all tie in together. All right, and then you need to know all the causes of desertification. So you need to know all of these. And of course, a lot of them tie into each other. One causes the other. So overgrazing by animals, which is going to lead to erosion because there's no root systems holding the soil down, and so more erosion is going to occur. Salinizations, increased saltiness in the soil. This comes from irrigation and the rising water table, which also reduces plant growth. Can't grow in salty soil. Water logging, again, if you water too much, basically, then they can die as well. Unsuitable terrains or soils for farming. So basically, there's certain crops that are good in certain soils, but if you're growing crops that aren't really suited for that area, then it can deplete the nutrients in that soil quite quickly. And then also, if you don't do crop rotation, then it's going to destroy the soil quicker. So, for example, if you have a crop that depletes nutrients in the soil, you could the next year plant a crop that replenishes nutrients, and that way that soil can be productive for a longer period of time. But if you never do that, you just keep planting crops that deplete the nutrients from the soil and aren't really appropriate for that type of soil, then of course it's not going to be as productive. So as time goes on, that soil that you're using is going to become less and less productive and get to the point to where you can't really grow anything in it anymore because there's nothing in there. And it's not like they just have a bunch of miracle grow they can throw on it. You know what deforestation is. Soil compaction, that ties in with the cattle as well. So as they're overgrazing, they're also compacting the soil. Oxygen cannot get to the root system of the plants. And then, of course, population growth. So more food is needed, requiring more farmers to try to farm and stuff, and there's just not enough land for them. And then oil. So looking at, as mentioned, the resources, they have a lot of amazing resources in Africa, but it's not necessarily helping these countries. And so we'll take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is the 6th leading exporter of oil in the world. So they should be incredibly rich, exporting that much oil. But because of a lot of issues, mismanagement by the government, by the oil companies, poor planning, corruption, especially in the government, has all led to big problems. So basically, the few rich people that control Nigeria and the few people that benefit from the oil trade in Nigeria, they keep all the money for themselves. Nothing goes to the people there in Nigeria. And because they're just trying to keep the money for themselves and kind of fuel the warlords and things like that, they're not interested in taking care of the environment either. So they've had over 4,000 oil spills on the Niger River, which goes through Nigeria, with no cleanup whatsoever. And so, there's literally parts of that river, if you drop a match in, it's going to light on fire. And then, like I said, fires, acid rain, air pollution, of course, and then pipeline explosions. Just in the year of 1999, there was 500 explosions and incidents on their pipelines. So they're not investing in the infrastructure. So if they actually invested in their infrastructure, they can make more money. But so, I mean, this really just comes down to the fact that you just have a bunch of warlords really controlling this. So if you don't know what a warlord is, basically think of like a giant gang. So instead of controlling like a neighborhood in Chicago, you're controlling, a big portion of a country. So Nigeria, one of the big terrorist organizations and warlords is Boko Haram. Boko Haram is the one that kidnapped those Nigerian schoolgirls a couple of years ago and using them for sex slaves. So these are horrible organizations that really benefit and get all the money off of these resources and then basically enslave their own people. Is basically what they're doing. And so your poorest people in Nigeria, this is how they live. I mean, these are homes along the Niger River. And for being the sixth leading oil exporter, I mean, that's obviously pathetic to be living like that when you got that much oil. All right, and then last thing, looking at human-environment interaction is the Aswan High Dam. So you need to know the pros and cons of this and why they even built the dam in the first place. So the Nile River it would flood every year, very predictably, same time every year, and recede every time every time during the same time of year. And that's why the ancient Egyptians relied on that river, because they knew it was very predictable. When it would flood, it would leave back silt, which it says somewhere right there, silt. Silt is a high nutrient soil. So it would leave the silt behind, the water recede, and then you could use that to farm, and it made crops come in quite easily. And so ancient Egyptians relied on this. I mean, this was the lifeblood of their civilization. It was one of the main goddesses they worshipped was Happy. That was her name, and she was the goddess of the Nile. And so that was the most important thing. After that, it's Ra, the sun god, because that's what provided life and the fact they even had a civilization. So you fast forward thousands of years, and you get to the Aswan High Dam. Because the problem is, even though it's predictable when the Nile would flood and how much it would flood and when it would recede, sometimes it would flood, more than expected, and sometimes it wouldn't flood at all, and there would be a drought, and then that would cause a famine. So to control the flooding, they built the dam. So now you have a regular supply of water all the time. You don't have to worry about not enough water to farm your crops, and then famines, and then protection from floods. So you can live, right next to the river, and you don't have to worry about the river flooding necessarily. All right, problems though that it created. So no more silt. So there's no silt when it comes to farming. So now you got to rely on fertilizers. Ancient treasures are sunken. I mean, Egypt, there's a lot we still don't know about ancient Egypt, and we still find a lot. I mean, we found a pyramid a couple of years ago. We just found an ancient city in Egypt a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of things that maybe we could have learned about the ancient Egyptians that is lost now. And then mosquitoes. Of course, they got a new breeding ground, especially in the lake, and they carry malaria and West Nile and stuff like that. And keep in mind, malaria kills a lot of people in Africa, especially children, which is really sad because it is easily preventable. So, like when I was in Venezuela, I took a malaria pill every day, about that big, and it prevented me from getting malaria. So I could get bit by however many mosquitoes, and I was fine because I took my malaria pill on a daily basis. And so, but they don't have the money to be able to pay for that and to be able to get that medicine to protect them. And so, over 1 million children every year die from malaria, something that's totally preventable. And this, of course, creates more problems for that. And then I forgot to delete this part right here. Someone got on my PowerPoint. Oh, well, so that's it for this presentation. So again, main ideas. Obviously, the Aswan High Dam, the pros and cons of this. Looking at mismanagement of resources like we looked at Nigeria. And then that connection between starvation, so looking at desertification and how that's going to affect the amount of arable land they have, and of course the impact of growing cash crops instead of crops that actually can feed people, and then the fact that you have people moving to cities, and how that puts more pressure on the farmer to be able to provide food for those people living in the cities instead of the countryside and farming. All right, so that's it for this one. So again, also make sure you take note of all these as well and know all the causes of desertification.